The flashlight beam flickered over cracked concrete, revealing a hidden seam in the floor. Nolan Whitford knelt, his breath shallow, as the ground shifted beneath him. His German shepherd Zeus stood motionless, eyes locked on a spot in the darkness, alert, waiting. A soft scrape echoed unnerving in the silence. Nolan's fingers brushed the floor, then froze. There was something there, a hidden entrance. He pried at the edge, and the floor moved slowly, revealing a narrow gap. A spiral staircase. Nolan's heart pounded, but when he shone the light below, what he found would change everything. What else was down there? Nolan's heart pounded as his flashlight swept over the dark, metal-lined walls of the workshop, illuminating nothing but rust and dust. Zeus, ever watchful, stood rigid beside him, his eyes fixed on the gap in the floor that had slowly, almost imperceptibly opened before them. The ground beneath their feet had shifted, revealing an unexpected opening, a narrow steel spiral staircase descending into the abyss below. Nolan's mind raced, battling between curiosity and caution. What the hell was this? The walls creaked and groaned as if the building itself were protesting this long-buried secret. Zeus's growl deepened, warning him to tread carefully, but the dog made no move to retreat. Nolan could feel the weight of the air shift thick with the scent of old machinery, and something heavier, something that shouldn't be there. His pulse quickened, a primal fear tugging at him. A bunker. He hesitated, breath shallow, then crouched low, peering into the pitch-black void below. The air, cold and metallic, brushed his skin. Every instinct told him to turn away. But then his flashlight flickered, lighting something unimaginable. Not a bunker, a plane. Nolan's grip tightened around the beam, a fighter jet, and just beyond it, another. The Chevy pickup bounced over the cracked, winding road as Nolan Whitford made his way into Silver Creek. It was the kind of town most people passed by without a second glance, a place that time seemed to have forgotten. No bustling downtown, no crowds. Just an endless stretch of old buildings and empty streets, their facades chipped and weathered, painted advertisements long faded from the walls. It was quiet, too quiet. Nolan welcomed it. This wasn't the first time he'd come to a town like this, small, forgotten, and tucked away, but something about Silver Creek felt different. It wasn't just that the town was empty. It was the way it felt, like no one had cared enough to even tear it down. It had simply been left to fade away and become part of the land again. That suited Nolan just fine. He didn't need much. Just a place to rest, a place to hide, a place to breathe. The truck's engine sputtered, fighting the cold Montana air. Nolan's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, the leather of his worn gloves creaking under pressure. His eyes, hidden behind dark sunglasses despite the overcast sky, stared straight ahead, but his mind wandered. He had been running for years, running from memories, from the war, from the ghosts that refused to let him be. When you spend so much time trying to outrun the past, you start to think it'll always be right behind you. It's a lie, though. It's never behind you. It's inside, buried deep. Next to him, Zeus lay on the passenger seat, his large head resting on his paws, watching the road ahead with a keen, quiet awareness. The dog's fur, a mix of gray and white, had begun to gray more noticeably in the last few years, and his once lustrous coat had become thinner with age. But Zeus's eyes, those sharp, intelligent eyes, hadn't changed. They were still the same eyes that had been watching Nolan's back in every deployment, every difficult night, every fight. They had seen things and they knew things. But more importantly, they had never stopped watching him, never stopped protecting him. They'd made it to the town limits by sunset. Nolan slowed the truck to a crawl as he neared the street that would lead him to his new home, or at least what he hoped could be a home. It was small, nothing more than a blip on the map, but that's all he needed. After years of moving, of being alone, he was ready for the silence, the solitude, the chance to settle down in peace. The buildings that lined the street were empty storefronts with peeling paint windows covered by dusty, yellowed curtains. Not a single soul was visible, and Nolan preferred it that way. A few distant lights flickered on, but that was the extent of life in Silver Creek. A faded sign marked the street corner Hawthorne Workshop. That was where he was headed. It was the place he'd bought on a whim, cheap land, cheap building, sight unseen. It had been the only property that had caught his eye, and something in his gut had told him it was the right choice. Nolan turned the truck off the main road, and the tires crunched over gravel, kicking up small clouds of dust as they approached the old workshop. A metal building sagging at the center, rusted at the edges, and covered in grime, it was exactly what he had expected. It was a warehouse of sorts, a relic of a time long past. As he pulled up to the front, a small office with a porch stood attached to the side of the building, almost hidden behind overgrown shrubs. There, waiting for him, was the old man, Mr. Preston, the man who had sold him the place. He was a wiry figure, lean and weather-beaten, dressed in worn denim overalls. Despite the cold, he wasn't wearing a jacket, just a flannel shirt and a tattered cap. His gaze was sharp though, his eyes twinkling behind thick glasses. "You made it," Preston greeted his voice gravelly, as if he had been saying those words to himself for a long time. "I'm here," Nolan replied, his voice rough with the weight of silence. Zeus lifted his head at the sound of Preston's voice ears flicking up. He didn't bark, he never did, but the dog's posture stiffened his sharp eyes, assessing the newcomer. As always, Zeus was ready watching for any hint of danger. Preston squinted at the dog. "He looks like he knows his business," he said with a nod. "He does," Nolan replied, not taking his eyes off the building. Preston gestured toward the workshop. "She's yours now. I hope you don't mind the condition. It's seen better days." He paused, looking over his shoulder. "The keys are inside." Nolan didn't respond right away. He glanced at the large metal doors of the workshop, rusted shut in places, but the building still had potential. He could see the work ahead of him, the patching of holes in the roof, the repairs to the windows, the reinforcement of the walls. But that didn't bother him. He was used to work, used to sweat and muscle. It was the only thing that ever made him feel alive. Preston seemed to sense Nolan's hesitation. "You should know something about this place," he said. "Colonel Hawthorne built it. Used to be a big shot in the Air Force. Had a thing for the Cold War, you know. He said he could outlast the end of the world in that old bunker beneath this place." Nolan's interest peaked at the mention of the bunker. Cold War relics, nuclear survival, secret vaults, those were the kind of things Nolan understood. He had spent years in dark places, some of them literally underground, and now it seemed like he had stumbled into another one. A bunker, Nolan echoed, testing the word on his tongue. Preston nodded. "Yeah, built the workshop right on top of it. Said he wanted to keep it secure in case the world went to hell. The foundation's reinforced. That's why the floor's so thick. If you ever get curious, the door's underneath somewhere." Nolan was already half turned toward the building, his mind working. A Cold War bunker beneath this place. It was a curious thing, and he had always found curiosity to be a useful trait. Not that he would ever say it out loud, he'd learned long ago that curiosity could be a dangerous thing, especially for someone like him. But something about Preston's words stuck with him. Preston continued, unaware of the thoughts racing through Nolan's head. "Well, the place is yours now. Good luck." Without another word, Preston turned and walked back to his truck, leaving Nolan and Zeus alone in the fading light of day. The wind had picked up, rattling the edges of the metal building, and the temperature had already started to drop, warning of the harsh Montana winter ahead. Nolan took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision settle in. He could almost feel the heavy silence of the place wrapping around him, the stillness so thick it was suffocating. But he was used to this kind of silence. He preferred it. He reached down to pat Zeus, who was still standing next to him, his fur bristling slightly against the cold. The dog's head tilted up, and Nolan met his gaze, an unspoken understanding passing between them. "Well, Z," Nolan muttered, his voice low, "let's get to work." With that, he turned toward the office door, his boots crunching over the gravel as Zeus followed closely behind. The old workshop loomed ahead, dark and foreboding, its rusting exterior hinting at the stories it had long kept hidden. Nolan had no idea what lay ahead, but he knew one thing for certain: this was where he would make his stand. As he stepped inside, the cold air from outside hit him, but the building was dead, quiet, save for the soft rattle of loose metal. Nolan flicked the light switch, and the weak hum of the single bulb overhead lit up a small room. Dust covered everything, old chairs, a desk, and shelves full of forgotten tools and parts. Zeus made his way to the corner, sniffing the air, his nose twitching as he surveyed the unfamiliar space. Nolan stood in the middle of the room for a moment, feeling the walls close in around him. There was something about this place, something about the isolation of it, that made him feel both at home and uneasy. The wind outside howled as it slipped through the cracks in the building, sending a shiver down Nolan's spine. But that was nothing new. Cold had always been something he could handle. Silence, on the other hand, had a way of creeping up on him when he least expected it. Nolan's mind drifted again, as it often did, to the past. The things he had seen, the things he had done, the men he had lost. Zeus, sensing his change in mood, padded over to him and nuzzled his leg, offering the quiet comfort that only the dog could provide. It was then that Nolan made a decision. He didn't know why he'd chosen this town, this workshop, or even this life. But one thing was clear: for the first time in years, he wasn't running anymore. He wasn't sure if that was a good thing or not, but it was something. And in this place, among the rust and the dust, it was all he had. Nolan spent the first few days after arriving at the Hawthorne workshop doing what he did best: working. He set to fixing the roof, patching the large holes in the corrugated metal that would eventually give way to the brutal Montana winter. His body ached by the end of each day, his hands raw and blistered from the labor, but that was exactly what he needed: distraction. Zeus followed him around the workshop, a silent sentinel, his watchful eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, his ears twitching at every sound. Nolan never paid much attention to the dog's habits. They'd been through so much together that he had learned to trust Zeus's instincts, but he didn't think much of the subtle changes in the dog's behavior as the days went by. It wasn't until the third day, as Nolan wrestled with a stubborn sheet of fiberglass insulation, that the change became too obvious to ignore. Zeus had stopped following Nolan around. The dog was no longer hovering near the workbench or laying on his favorite spot by the office door. Instead, Zeus was sitting at the back of the workshop, staring at a section of the wall, his gaze fixed and unblinking. Nolan glanced over his shoulder, wiping sweat from his brow. "Zeus, what's got you so worked up?" The dog didn't move, didn't even glance up. He was still watching the same spot in the far corner where a bricked-up fireplace stood, its mortar old and cracked. It looked like just another forgotten part of the building, neglected and left behind, but something about Zeus's unrelenting attention made Nolan pause. Nolan's instinct, honed from years of military service, told him that something wasn't right. It wasn't the usual curiosity behavior that Zeus exhibited when he'd noticed a squirrel or a deer outside. This was different. This was focused, unnerving. He set down the fiberglass and walked over to the corner where Zeus sat, his body tense. "What is it, boy?" Nolan asked softly, bending down to examine the dog's unwavering stare. Zeus didn't react to Nolan's voice. Instead, the dog's front paws pressed into the floor, his claws scraping softly against the concrete as he edged closer to the wall. Nolan crouched beside him and looked at the spot Zeus was fixated on. It was an old fireplace, its brickwork uneven, the mortar patched hastily in some places as if someone had done the job without much care. It was obvious that no one had used the fireplace in decades, a relic of an older, colder time. Nolan sighed, frustrated. He wasn't sure what to make of it. He wasn't a historian or a detective. He was a mechanic, a soldier. Things had a purpose. Things were fixed or replaced or ignored. This wall. It didn't make sense. It was just a wall, right? But Zeus was still staring at it, his eyes wide and unblinking. "What do you know that I don't, huh?" Nolan muttered to himself, giving the dog a resigned pat on the back. Zeus stood up and trotted over to the fireplace, his tail tucked low between his legs. He nudged at the old brickwork with his nose, sniffing the edges, before backing up slightly, giving Nolan a look. Nolan followed the dog's actions, kneeling down to inspect the brickwork more closely. There was a faint draft coming from the mortar, barely noticeable, but it was there. He reached forward and ran his fingers along the brick, feeling the coldness of it. His mind clicked into gear, trained from years of both fixing things and seeking out hidden truths. Something was off. This wasn't just a decaying fireplace. It was a decoy. Nolan pushed harder on the mortar, a low scraping sound filling the space as the old brittle brick moved slightly under his touch. It wasn't much, a fraction of an inch, but it was enough to make Nolan's pulse quicken. His flashlight, still on the ground from earlier, caught the slight gap that had opened, revealing something darker behind the wall. Zeus, now beside him, stood still as a statue, his ears perked, watching every movement Nolan made. Nolan stared at the small gap, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, but he knew this wasn't just an abandoned fireplace. There was something hidden here, something important. With a quick decision, Nolan stood up and stepped away. "Let's see what you're hiding." He made his way to the small office attached to the workshop, his boots scraping against the concrete floor. He grabbed a crowbar that had been left behind by the previous owner. It was rusted but still sturdy enough to pry apart whatever was hiding behind that wall. Zeus followed him, his tail giving a slow wag, his eyes still locked on the fireplace. The dog's demeanor hadn't changed. He was on alert, waiting for Nolan to take action. Nolan looked at the dog, then back at the fireplace. He'd been a soldier for too long to ignore the warning signs. This wasn't just some crumbling piece of a forgotten building. This was something more. Nolan returned to the fireplace and knelt down again, his hands gripping the crowbar tightly. He wedged it into the small crack he had found, putting all his weight into the task. The metal groaned under pressure, but slowly the mortar began to give. A heavy dust filled the air, and Nolan coughed, but didn't stop. His fingers ached as he pried more and more of the brickwork loose. Finally, with a sudden crack, the last of the bricks broke free, revealing a steel plate beneath them. It wasn't just any steel plate. It was heavy industrial grade, and it looked like it had been sealed tight for decades. Nolan could see the faintest outline of a handle, rusted and almost entirely covered by the surrounding debris. He wiped away some of the dust and dirt, revealing more of the mechanism. It was old, military grade, something far beyond what he had expected to find. His breath caught in his throat. He had seen designs like this before during his time in the service. It was a hatch, an entrance to something. Zeus stood beside him, his gaze unwavering as he studied the hatch, the dog's instinctive sense of danger palpable. Nolan felt a chill run down his spine. The hatch was real, and it was locked. His mind raced a bunker, he thought. A Cold War bunker. Preston had mentioned it casually, but now that he was staring at this hidden door, it felt like a trap. What kind of place would have something like this buried beneath it? Why had the colonel gone to such lengths to keep it hidden? Nolan's eyes flicked over to Zeus. The dog's body was stiff, his muscles tense. He could feel the unease radiating from him. The air around them was thick with something Nolan couldn't place attention, a sense of anticipation. But despite the growing fear in his chest, Nolan's curiosity got the better of him. "I guess there's only one way to find out, huh, boy?" Nolan murmured more to himself than to Zeus. With a final decisive motion, he grabbed the handle, giving it a forceful tug. The steel groaned in protest, but the hatch slowly began to give. It was heavier than he had expected, but with another heave, it opened just enough for Nolan to see the dark, narrow staircase descending into the abyss below. The musty air that rushed up from the depths was thick with the smell of aged oil metal and something more, something older forgotten. Nolan's flashlight flickered as he shone it down the staircase, but the beam only cut a small slice of light into the impenetrable darkness. Zeus growled low in his throat again, his stance protective. This was it. Nolan had opened a door, but what lay beyond was no ordinary mystery. This was something far bigger, something that would change everything. With a deep breath, Nolan steadied himself. Whatever it was, there was no turning back now. And so without a second thought, Nolan stepped forward, his dog following closely behind. The air grew colder. As Nolan descended the narrow, creaking staircase, the faint glow of his flashlight barely cutting through the thick darkness below. Zeus, ever faithful, padded silently behind him, his breath steady but his body taut with anticipation. The metallic scent of oil and old machinery filled the air, clinging to everything, making the atmosphere thick, almost suffocating. The further they went, the quieter it became. The creaks of the workshop above seemed a distant memory, swallowed by the immense silence of the underground space. Nolan's heart thudded heavily in his chest, not from fear, but from something far more primal. What had Hawthorne hidden down here? The question bounced around in his head unanswered, and growing louder the deeper they went. He reached the bottom of the staircase and stepped onto a solid concrete floor. His flashlight beam cut across the vast empty expanse before him, but the light swallowed itself, fading into the infinite blackness. The room was enormous, impossibly so. The size of it alone was enough to make Nolan's mind struggle to comprehend. But it wasn't the space that made his skin prickle. It was what lay within it. Covered in heavy, custom-fitted tarps, the outlines of large shapes were barely visible in the dim light. Planes. Nolan blinked. This wasn't just an old warehouse or a forgotten storage space. It was a vault, a treasure trove of history long locked away from the world. Zeus growled softly behind him, his body rigid, his eyes scanning the vast space. Nolan, heart-hammering, took a hesitant step forward. His breath came out in a small cloud of fog, the chill of the room making it hard to shake off the weight in his chest. This place, this buried sanctuary, was not just a relic of the past. It was something much more dangerous, far more valuable. Nolan's flashlight flicked across the first covered shape. His fingers tightened around the beam, the cold metal slipping in his grasp as he pulled back the tarp. What he uncovered made his pulse spike. A P-51 Mustang, perfectly preserved. The plane's sleek body gleamed under the thin light. The riveted aluminum, the sharp, elegant curves of the fuselage, the unmistakable shape of the cockpit canopy. It was all there untouched, frozen in time. The years of dust and decay seemed to hold no sway over the machine. It stood as if it could take flight at any moment. Nolan staggered back, his mind spinning. He had expected old equipment, maybe some military surplus, some forgotten parts, but this was an original P-51 Mustang, one of the finest aircraft ever made. How had Hawthorne done this? Zeus's growl deepened a low, constant rumble that filled the space. Nolan, though stunned, found his feet moving again. He moved to the next covered shape, his mind struggling to make sense of the impossible scene in front of him. He pulled back the tarp again, revealing a Supermarine Spitfire, its sleek elliptical wings still painted in faded camouflage. Another priceless relic. Nolan stood hands, shaking his flashlight, darting across the cavernous space. There were more. Row after row of aircraft, each covered and preserved. A collection, an obsession. He took a step back, his breath caught in his throat. The scale of the operation hit him then. This wasn't just some private collection, this was an archive. A living, breathing history of aviation buried beneath a quiet town in Montana hidden for decades. Nolan's eyes widened, and for the first time since entering the underground vault, he felt the enormity of what he had stumbled upon. Zeus, ever the guard dog, was still on alert, his body tense and his eyes trained on the shadows that clung to the corners of the room. Nolan turned his flashlight toward a corner he hadn't yet explored. There, covered in a thick layer of dust, were rows of military crates, their stamped markings barely visible through the grime. Nolan moved toward them, the anticipation of discovery sharp in his chest. As he reached one of the crates, his flashlight swept across the label. Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a new never-used engine. Nolan could hardly believe what he was seeing. These weren't just planes. They were the core of a treasure trove, preserved with the kind of care that only someone with a single-minded obsession could muster. His mind raced. How could Hawthorne have done this? This collection couldn't have been thrown together easily. It had taken time, money, dedication. Nolan had been a soldier. He knew how things like this were built, how secrets were kept. Hawthorne had spent years collecting, smuggling, hiding. And now, after all this time, the vault had been uncovered by a man who had no idea what he was walking into. As Nolan pulled open the crate and stared at the pristine engine, the weight of the discovery pressed down on him. There was a personal cost to this, find an ethical dilemma that he couldn't ignore. He wasn't sure why, but something about this collection felt wrong. Not wrong in a criminal sense, but wrong in the way it had been hidden away, locked in the earth. For what purpose? He turned back to the row of planes, his flashlight flicking over their gleaming, dormant bodies. There was something almost sacred about them, as though they had been waiting for someone to remember their value, to honor the legacy they represented. Zeus whined softly, pulling him from his thoughts. The dog had moved closer, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. Nolan watched him, the unease in the dog's posture mirroring his own growing discomfort. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was too much for one person, too much to be kept hidden. Suddenly, the soft echo of a door creaking startled Nolan. His hand instinctively went to his waist where his old worn sidearm rested, but he stopped short. The sound wasn't the door. It was the faint groaning of a mechanism somewhere deeper in the vault, hidden behind the massive steel door that sealed off the rest of the underground space. Nolan's heart skipped a beat. He took a step back, his mind racing. What was that? The sound came again, a low grinding noise that reverberated through the floor. His breath hitched and Zeus's ears perked up. Nolan's flashlight darted toward the wall, looking for any signs of movement. Nothing. But the air had shifted, thickening with the sensation of something shifting beneath them, something alive. Nolan's pulse quickened. There was a secret here, a hidden, dangerous truth that hadn't yet revealed itself. And that sound, it wasn't just an echo, it was something new, something mechanical, a switch, a system coming online. The next noise came louder, followed by the deep metallic thud of something heavy being moved. Nolan froze. Whatever he had uncovered, it was far more than he could have imagined. The vault had been sealed for decades, yet now it seemed like the past was awakening. As the air grew heavier with anticipation, Nolan's hand tightened around his flashlight. Whatever had been buried here, whatever Colonel Hawthorne had tried so desperately to protect, was now his responsibility, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for it. Zeus let out a soft whine, as if to remind him of the responsibility they both now carried. Nolan swallowed hard. He needed to know more, and to do that he had to open the next door. Nolan's mind raced as the low grinding noise echoed again, this time more forceful, as if the vault itself was waking from a long slumber. Zeus shifted uneasily at his side, his tail-tucked low eyes scanning the shadows. The dog's instincts were razor-sharp, and right now Zeus was telling him something was off. It wasn't just the eerie silence of the underground hangar, it was the presence of something unseen, something hidden deep beneath the layers of concrete and steel. Nolan's flashlight flickered again, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife, but the shadows seemed to swallow it whole. His heart pounded against his ribcage, and he stood frozen for a moment, listening. The sound had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence that felt too thick to breathe through. Every inch of the room seemed to vibrate with an untold story, and Nolan, for the first time since stepping into the vault, felt the weight of the secret he had uncovered. Whatever lay ahead, it wasn't just about the planes or the engines, it was about the man who had collected them and the choices he had made. Nolan swallowed the bitter taste of unease, rising in his throat. The Colonel's obsession had been more than just about history, it had been a need to protect. But protect what he took. A deep breath, and made his way toward the far end of the hangar, where the faintest outline of a steel door stood against the wall, partially obscured by more tarped planes. Zeus moved with him, ever at his side, his nose twitching. Nolan could feel the change in the air, something pressing against the walls of the hangar as if waiting to be discovered. The door was massive, its surface rusted the edges, lined with the same age-old grime that clung to the rest of the vault. But this door was different. There were no tarps here, no dust. It stood untouched, the steel gleaming faintly under the beam of Nolan's flashlight. This was the heart of the bunker, the place where everything had been hidden, and where he realized the Colonel's obsession might have gone too far. Nolan reached for the handle, but his hand paused midair. His mind was working, piecing together the fragments of the story. Colonel Hawthorne had not just collected planes, he had protected something. Perhaps it wasn't the planes at all, but the stories they carried, the legacy of men who had fought and died in them. A fighter jet wasn't just a machine, it was a vessel of memory, of sacrifice, of honor. The Colonel's obsession had been about preserving more than metal. It had been about ensuring the past never vanished. But for what price? His fingers curled around the handle and he twisted. The door opened with a grinding groan, and for the first time since entering the vault, Nolan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The air behind the door was different, stale, cold, yet oddly clean. It smelled like machinery, but there was something else beneath it, something faintly metallic, like iron. Zeus's low growl was the only sound as they stepped through. The door creaked shut behind them, sealing them into the room with a soft thud. Nolan raised his flashlight, scanning the space in front of him. The room was small, but it was packed with something far more valuable than the plane's files. Stacks of old papers, manila folders, and books lined the shelves on either side. There was a large wooden desk at the center of the room, stacked with documents and old yellowed books. On the desk, a faded ledger lay open, its pages filled with careful handwriting. Nolan's heart skipped. This wasn't just a collection of planes, this was Colonel Hawthorne's life. Every plane, every part, every engine, every inch of this vault was cataloged, logged, and protected with meticulous care. This wasn't a man collecting for wealth or fame. This was a man who believed in legacy. His legacy, and now it was Nolan's responsibility whether he liked it or not. Nolan stepped forward and ran his fingers along the edge of the desk. The wood was old but sturdy. He opened the ledger, and the first page read, P-51 Mustang, serial no, 42 Punish, 339. Transported from Davis-Monthan AFB condition fare. It was a list of planes, engines, and parts, each entry, more detailed than the last. But it wasn't the planes that grabbed Nolan's attention, it was the final entry at the bottom of the page. Final estimated insured value, $100,000,000. Nolan's breath caught in his chest, and he felt the weight of the words sink into his bones. $100 million. The number seemed so absurd, so distant, that it didn't even feel real. He flicked through more pages, and it was the same, a catalog of rare and irreplaceable aircraft, each more valuable than the last. But the one thing that struck him was the obsession, the Colonel's obsession, with keeping them safe away from the greedy hands of collectors and governments. The last few pages were handwritten, the ink fading with age but still legible. The collection is complete. The hangar is sealed. My time is short. I do not know who will find this, but I ask only one thing. Do the right thing. Protect them. They are not just machines. They are the vessels of the men who flew them. They are not for one man. They are for everyone. Nolan's fingers trembled as he read the final entry, the weight of it pressing down on him. The Colonel had known that one day someone would find this place. Someone like him. But why? What had he hoped for? Did Hawthorne really think someone would come to protect his collection? Zeus let out a low whine from behind him, his eyes locked on Nolan, waiting for something, anything from his owner. Nolan stood there, lost in the words on the page. Do the right thing. What did that even mean? The Colonel's collection was worth millions, perhaps more. The idea of selling just one plane, just one, would solve all his financial problems. Zeus's health was deteriorating, and the vet bills weren't going to stop coming. Nolan thought of the life he could have if he just took what was in front of him. The temptation was powerful, but something in the back of his mind, something deep in his gut, told him that taking that money would destroy something far more important than just the Colonel's legacy. But the Colonel had asked for this, hadn't he? Do the right thing. It wasn't about money, it was about history. The planes weren't just collectibles, they were memories. The lives of young men who had given everything. Zeus nudged his leg again, and Nolan snapped back to reality. He turned away from the ledger and walked toward the plane closest to him. His hand hovered over the cold, smooth metal of the Mustang. There was a responsibility here, a moral weight that was slowly sinking in. Do the right thing. But Nolan had no idea what the right thing was. Not yet. The silence of the vault pressed in on Nolan as he stood in front of the P-51 Mustang, his hand hovering above the sleek, cold metal. Zeus, still by his side, seemed to understand the weight of the moment, his presence grounding Nolan in a way the vast, empty hangar could not. The temptation, the pull of what lay in this vault, was unlike anything Nolan had ever experienced. But for all the value, all the history, all the legacy, something inside him twisted uncomfortably. He had spent his life trying to outrun temptation, trying to avoid the kind of choices that led to regret. Now here he was, staring at the first real chance he had ever had to change everything. But at what cost? Nolan looked back at the ledger still open on the desk, the final line haunting him, "Do the right thing." The words echoed in his mind like a drumbeat, drowning out all other thoughts. What was the right thing? For years, Nolan had prided himself on knowing exactly what was right and what was wrong, but this was different. He wasn't just looking at a plane. He wasn't just looking at a collection of aircraft. He was staring at a legacy, a history that was not his own, and it was in his hands now. The weight of responsibility settled on him like a heavy coat. He wasn't sure what was driving him, but something about the idea of selling a piece of this collection, of tearing it apart for money, felt wrong in his gut. Maybe it was the way Colonel Hawthorne had gone to such lengths to protect it. Maybe it was the fact that the Colonel had wanted this collection to be remembered, to live on, not locked away in some underground vault. A low growl interrupted Nolan's thoughts. He turned slowly, his eyes meeting Zeus's. The dog stood still, his body, rigid eyes fixed on something in the dark corner of the hangar. Zeus's tail was still, his muscles tensed, and Nolan could feel the shift in the air. The dog was on alert, sensing something Nolan could not yet see. "What is it, boy?" Nolan muttered, his voice low. He could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Whatever Zeus was sensing, it wasn't good. Zeus took a step forward, his head held high. Nolan followed the dog's gaze toward the corner where the shadows seemed to swirl unnaturally. There, nestled between two old crates, was something Nolan hadn't noticed before. At first he thought it was just more debris, but as his flashlight cut through the dark, he saw it a door, partially hidden, blending in with the worn walls of the hangar. The edges of the door were rough, but the metal surrounding it was cold, industrial grade. It wasn't part of the usual architecture of the vault. It was something new, something out of place. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just an old storage room, not just another corner of the hangar. It was another secret. He walked over cautiously with Zeus close behind the dog's growl, now a steady vibration in his chest. Nolan's fingers brushed over the cold metal of the door's surface. A keyhole. This was no ordinary passage. It was locked. Whatever lay beyond this door, whatever Hawthorne had hidden here, it was important. And for the first time, Nolan felt a surge of fear. The Colonel had been obsessive about his planes, but what if this was more? What if it was something Nolan wasn't meant to uncover? Nolan's pulse quickened. His fingers found a crowbar resting against a nearby crate. He grabbed it, his heart pounding the metal, feeling cold and heavy in his hands. The crowbar fit easily between the edges of the doorframe, and with a grunt, Nolan wrenched it open. The door groaned under the pressure, its rusted hinges protesting as it swung inward with a slow, agonizing movement. The air behind the door was cold, thick with the musty smell of old documents, stale air, and something Nolan couldn't place. He stepped forward, holding his flashlight high, the beam cutting through the darkness. The room was small, its walls lined with shelves that held boxes and crates, each meticulously labeled. Nolan's heart sank. More boxes, more documents. But as he stepped deeper into the room, the beam of his flashlight illuminated something else, a tall, cylindrical shape covered in thick black tarps. It stood at the back of the room, a shadow among shadows, as if it were waiting for him. The object's outline was unmistakable. A plane. Another one. Nolan felt his throat tighten. He had to know. He approached cautiously, his eyes never leaving the tarp. Zeus, who had been silent until now, growled low, his teeth bared as if he could sense the wrongness of what lay before them. With trembling hands, Nolan grabbed the edge of the tarp and pulled. The fabric slid off easily, revealing what lay underneath. It was not a plane. Not this time. What stood before him was something far worse. A full-scale military-grade bomb. A weapon, and beside it a large sealed crate filled with other military equipment, munitions, tools of war. Nolan froze, his eyes widening. His hand shot to his side, instinctively reaching for his gun, but he didn't draw it. His breath came out in short, shallow bursts. This wasn't just a collection of airplanes, it was a bunker, a stockpile of war relics hidden away, buried beneath the town. Hawthorne had kept this place secret, not just for its historical value, but for protection. He had stockpiled military-grade equipment beneath Silver Creek, preparing for something that might never come, but always on the lookout for the moment when it might. Nolan stepped back, his mind reeling. What was Hawthorne's plan? Why had he buried this here? Had he feared the end of the world? Was this his final act of preservation, keeping weapons of war hidden beneath a forgotten town? Zeus continued to growl louder, now his stance more aggressive. Nolan glanced at him, and then back at the bomb, his thoughts racing. There was no denying it anymore. This wasn't just about the planes. This was about Hawthorne's legacy, and it was darker, far darker than Nolan had ever imagined. Shit, Nolan muttered under his breath. The enormity of what lay before him hit him like a punch to the stomach. The colonel had been more than an eccentric. He had been preparing for the unthinkable. Nolan felt the weight of the choices pressing down on him. He had already stepped too far into this vault, and now he couldn't walk away. The door was open. The secret was exposed. But what now? How would he handle this discovery? Was he prepared to be the man who carried this weight forward? Could he? Should he? Zeus whined, moving closer to him, nuzzling his side as if trying to ground him in reality. The dog's loyalty was unwavering, a constant in a world that had begun to crumble around Nolan. Nolan swallowed hard. He could feel the gravity of the situation deep in his chest, the moral dilemma he had been avoiding now staring him dead in the face. He had thought he was here to fix a broken workshop. He had thought he was here to escape. But now, as he stood at the threshold of the colonel's final legacy, he knew he was standing at the edge of something much bigger. And whatever he chose, it was going to change everything. The weight of the discovery was crushing, and Nolan stood there in the small, cold room staring at the bomb and crates, his breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. Zeus was still by his side, more alert than ever, his eyes never leaving the crates, his low growl rumbling through the tension-filled air. For a moment, Nolan was paralyzed, the enormity of what he'd uncovered threatening to consume him. He thought of his life before Silver Creek, before the workshop, before the bomb. He thought of the ghosts that had followed him home, the memories of war that never truly left him. He had always known that his own scars ran deep. But Colonel Hawthorne's legacy, the secrets buried beneath the town, felt like a different kind of weight, one that Nolan couldn't just walk away from. His whole life had been about survival, but now for the first time he had a chance to make a choice. Could he live with the knowledge of this place, of what lay beneath Silver Creek? Could he walk away and pretend that this part of history, this dangerous stockpile, didn't exist? A soft scraping sound echoed from the corner of the room. Nolan's head snapped to the side, but Zeus was already moving, his body tense. The dog wasn't growling now, but his muscles were tight, his every movement calculated. Zeus had always been the first to sense danger, and Nolan trusted the dog's instincts more than his own sometimes. Nolan's hand reached for his flashlight, his fingers curling around the cold steel as he scanned the dark corners of the room. The scraping sound stopped as abruptly as it had started, but the air was thick, with something Nolan couldn't quite place, an unease that gnawed at his gut. The vault had already revealed its first secret, but Nolan had no illusions that it was the last. He turned back to the bomb, his pulse racing. Was Hawthorne's plan really to use this place as some sort of safe haven, a stockpile for a war that might never come? A sense of dread settled over him. This wasn't just a collection of planes, it was a place of protection. But protection for who, for what? He knew nothing about Hawthorne's personal life, beyond the few words Preston had shared. Was the colonel paranoid, or was he simply trying to preserve something that mattered more than just the planes? For the first time in years, Nolan felt that sense of danger, the one that always preceded the moment when something went wrong. He had been careful, cautious, but there was a nagging feeling now, something telling him that it was time to leave the vault. Time to stop digging. Zeus's sudden bark jolted him from his thoughts. Nolan spun, but it was too late. Before he could even react, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him. The door to the vault, a door Nolan had left slightly ajar, creaked open. Nolan's heart skipped. No, it couldn't be. He moved swiftly, drawing his sidearm, his breath coming in sharp, quick bursts as he stepped toward the entrance. Whoever had come down into the vault was not supposed to be here. Nolan's instincts screamed at him to move, but he kept his eyes trained on the darkness beyond the door. The figure that appeared in the doorway was an old man, tall, thin, and wearing a dark jacket, a piece of machinery gleaming in his hand. Nolan's finger twitched on the trigger, but the man didn't seem threatening. He didn't even look surprised to see Nolan. Colonel Hawthorne, Nolan asked, his voice rough. The man stepped into the light, revealing the full extent of his age. His hair was a silvery white, and his face was weathered with years of hard living. He held the piece of machinery in his hand like it was nothing more than a tool, a relic of his work. There was a calmness in his eyes, but also something dark, a weariness that Nolan immediately recognized. This man, whoever he was, had been living in the shadow of the vault, just like Nolan had been living in the shadow of his past. No, the man answered, simply shaking his head. I'm not Colonel Hawthorne. Nolan's brow furrowed, but he didn't lower his gun. The stranger's words lingered in the air, and for a moment it felt like time stood still. Nolan's eyes narrowed. Then who the hell are you? The man hesitated, his eyes flicking to the rows of planes and crates around them as if searching for the right words. "I'm his son," he finally said, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. Arthur Hawthorne Jr. Nolan froze, his heart pounding. The weight of the moment hit him all at once. The colonel had a son. Why hadn't anyone mentioned this before? Why hadn't he heard about this man, this possible heir to the vault and its secrets? The older Hawthorne Arthur Jr. took a slow step forward, his eyes meeting Nolan's. There was no fear in them, just resolve. "My father didn't want anyone to know about me," he said softly, his voice tinged with regret. He was a man of his time, obsessed with his work, obsessed with preserving what he believed was history. But he didn't want anyone to be part of it, not even me. Nolan's grip on his gun tightened. "Then why are you here?" Arthur Jr. looked down at the floor, the years of secrecy weighing heavily on him. "I found out what my father was hiding. I didn't want it to be true. I didn't want to be part of it. But the truth is, he left me this vault. It's my responsibility now. And it's time someone did something with it." Nolan blinked, his mind spinning. This man was the key to everything. He had been here all along, watching his father's obsession, watching the vault, but never intervening. Nolan's mind was a mess of questions, and yet he knew one thing. The colonel's legacy wasn't as simple as it had seemed. Arthur Jr. stepped closer to the desk, his hand resting gently on the open ledger. "I'm not here to take anything from you, Nolan, but I do need your help. There are people, dangerous people, who want what's hidden down here. They don't care about history. They only care about the profit. And they won't stop until they get it." Nolan's eyes locked on Arthur Jr.'s, the gravity of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just a secret vault anymore. This was a war, a battle for control. Zeus growled at the stranger, a warning Nolan couldn't ignore. But Nolan wasn't thinking about that now. He was thinking about the colonel's final words. Do the right thing, and the legacy that had fallen on his shoulders. "Help you?" Nolan asked, his voice thick with Arthur Jr., sighed, looking tired. "Because, Nolan, you're already a part of this. And whether you like it or not, you're the one who found it. The planes, the weapons, the history, it's all connected. And you can't walk away. Not now." Nolan's mind was reeling, his stomach twisted. The past had a way of catching up with him, and this was no ordinary secret. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. Nolan's mind spun, the weight of everything he had uncovered finally crashing down on him. Arthur Hawthorne Jr.'s words hung in the air, dense with implication. This wasn't just a collection of war relics. It was more than a vault of planes and equipment. It was a dangerous, deadly secret, and Nolan had unknowingly stepped into the middle of it all. Zeus was still at Nolan's side, but even the dog seemed to sense the danger in the air, his body taut, his posture rigid. Nolan could feel the tension, the dread creeping in. Everything had changed in an instant. The vault was no longer a quiet sanctuary. It was a battlefield. "So what do you want from me?" Nolan asked, his voice low but steady. His eyes never left Arthur Jr., who stood with a grim expression, looking like a man who had lived in shadows for too long. "I need you to help me protect it," Arthur Jr. said, his tone calm but resolute. "My father didn't trust anyone with this, but I can't do it alone. The world has changed, Nolan. There are men out there who would sell this collection to the highest bidder, and once it's gone for good. You don't understand what this means, what this could mean." Nolan clenched his jaw, frustration bubbling up from within. The choice before him was suffocating. His hands, once steady from years of mechanics and military service, now trembled. The planes in the vault were worth more than he could ever fathom. Each one was a piece of history, a symbol of men who had fought and died in a time that now felt far removed from the present. And yet here, he was caught between doing the right thing and securing his own future, a future that had felt elusive for far too long. "But why me?" Nolan demanded, his voice tight with skepticism. "Why come to me? I'm just a man who fixes things. I'm not some guardian of history." Arthur Jr. paused, studying him with a knowing look. "Because you've already chosen, Nolan. You've already seen the legacy, the weight of what Hawthorne left behind. It's not about what you think you want. It's about what's already inside you. You're a soldier. You understand sacrifice duty. This isn't just about selling planes or hoarding treasures. This is about protecting something that could be lost forever if the wrong people get their hands on it." The air in the room seemed to grow even heavier. Nolan could hear the hum of his breath, his thoughts racing. His eyes flicked toward the row of planes, sleek, deadly, and beautiful in their own right. And then he looked back at Arthur Jr. He didn't know if the man was asking too much, or if Nolan was the only one who could answer this impossible call. And then, like a sharp, painful reminder, Nolan's gaze turned to Zeus. The dog's eyes, always so full of understanding, were now soft and steady. Zeus was calm, but his presence made it clear Nolan was not alone. The enormity of the situation was pressing in on him, suffocating him. But at that moment, he knew what he had to do. His heart had already made the choice for him. It wasn't about money or survival anymore. It was about doing the right thing. "I'll help you," Nolan said finally, his voice clear though it carried a weight of resolve. He glanced down at the dog, who gave a small, approving huff in return. Zeus was with him as always. Arthur Jr. looked relieved, though his face remained clouded with the knowledge of what lay ahead. He walked over to the desk, retrieving a small, worn notebook and handing it to Nolan. "This," Arthur Jr. said, "is the final part of the puzzle. It's the key to everything my father protected. The codes, the plans, the why, it's all in there. It's a journal. My father's. You'll need it." Nolan took the journal, feeling the leather-bound book's weight in his hands. It felt like a bridge between the past and present, a tangible link to everything Colonel Hawthorne had sacrificed for. Nolan could feel the responsibility settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about protecting the planes anymore. This was about guarding the Colonel's legacy, his final wish to ensure that the past would not be lost to greed. "This isn't just a collection," Nolan muttered as he flipped through the first few pages of the journal, skimming the handwritten entries. "This is a war." Arthur Jr. gave a single nod. "Exactly. And there are people who will stop at nothing to get what's hidden down here. They'll come for the planes, for the bombs, for the engines. They'll come for everything my father protected, and they won't stop until it's all gone." Nolan's stomach tightened. The gravity of their task was becoming clearer with every word. They were no longer just standing in the vault beneath Silver Creek. They were standing on the precipice of something much larger, something dangerous. Suddenly, the vault's silence was broken by the sound of footsteps from the staircase. Zeus's growl returned sharp and fierce, his ears flattened against his head. Nolan's heart skipped a beat. "Stay here," Nolan said, his voice low and commanding. He quickly moved to the edge of the room, his eyes scanning the shadows of the hangar for movement. The last thing he needed was for their presence to be discovered too soon. He motioned for Arthur Jr. to stay behind, stepping forward with the caution of a soldier. Zeus followed Nolan instinctively, his stance alert. As Nolan reached the foot of the stairs, he peeked into the dim light above. His eyes narrowed. There, standing at the top of the staircase, was a figure cloaked in shadow. But Nolan didn't need to see the face to know who it was. It was the man who had been hunting them, the one who had been following their every move since Nolan stepped into the vault. A voice gravelly and cold called down to him. "I see you've finally decided to play along." Nolan's grip on his gun tightened. The figure was holding something, a long, sleek rifle aimed directly at Nolan. "I don't think you understand the man," said his voice, low threatening. "This place belongs to us now, all of it, and I'll make sure you never get the chance to protect it." The tension in the air was thick. Zeus growled loudly, his body poised to leap forward. Nolan's mind raced, thinking through every possible way to get out of this situation, but his focus never wavered. One thing was clear: this wasn't just about protecting the legacy anymore. This was about surviving. "Not if I can help it," Nolan said, his voice sharp. And in the silence that followed, Nolan made his move. The morning after the confrontation in the vault, the world outside seemed untouched by the chaos that had unfolded in the cold shadows of the hangar. The sun rose slowly over Silver Creek, casting long, warm beams through the thin clouds. The world was still. But Nolan, for the first time in a long while, felt the weight of his choices settle comfortably around him. He stood by the door of the workshop, his hand resting on Zeus's head as the dog sat by his side, loyal as ever. The day ahead was uncertain, but for once the uncertainty wasn't filled with dread. It was filled with purpose. The town had begun to come together, the initial skepticism fading as people worked hand in hand to preserve the history that had been hidden beneath their feet for so long. The once derelict hangar had become a beacon, a symbol not just of wartime history, but of something deeper, a reminder of what it meant to protect what mattered, to fight for something greater than personal gain or survival. Nolan had learned over the course of his life that doing the right thing wasn't always easy. In fact, it was often the hardest choice to make. And for someone like him, a man whose past had been defined by the need to escape the weight of responsibility, felt like both a burden and a lifeline. He had stepped into this town seeking isolation, but now with the vault's secret safe and its legacy honored, he found himself not alone but part of something greater. There was still work to be done, of course. The vault wasn't just a sanctuary, it was a time capsule, a reservoir of history and memories that needed to be shared with the world. Nolan and Arthur Jr. had spent the last few weeks organizing a plan to turn the hangar into a proper museum, a place where people from all walks of life could come to learn to see, to understand the sacrifices made by those who had flown in the planes that now lined the vault's walls. It wouldn't be easy, but it would be right. As Nolan looked around at the quiet town, the frost melting on the ground, the distant mountains bathed in the soft glow of early morning, he felt a deep sense of peace. For the first time in years, he no longer felt like he was running. He wasn't just a man trying to escape his past. He was a man who had found a place where he could stand firm, where he could make a difference. He glanced down at Zeus, who met his gaze with a look that was almost human in its understanding. The dog's tail wagged once, and Nolan felt a rush of warmth in his chest. Through all the pain, the loss, the struggle, Zeus had been his constant, his partner, his friend. Together they had found a new purpose. They had preserved something that could never be replaced, and in doing so they had found redemption. "Let's go, boy," Nolan whispered, a smile tugging at his lips. "We've got work to do." With Zeus by his side, Nolan headed down the gravel path that led to the town. The hangar was behind them, its doors now wide open, welcoming the world into a history that had been locked away for too long. As Nolan walked forward, he realized that sometimes the greatest treasures weren't the ones found in vaults or hidden beneath the earth. They were the moments of connection, of loyalty, of choosing to do what was right, even when it wasn't easy. In the end, it wasn't the planes or the weapons or the secrets that mattered. It was the people, their stories, their sacrifices, and the legacy they left behind. And as the sun rose higher, casting a golden light over Silver Creek, Nolan knew that he was no longer alone. He had found his place in the world not as an outsider, but as a protector of the past and a guardian of the future. Zeus trotted beside him, content in the knowledge that whatever came next, they would face it together. They had done the right thing.